Welcome to the Daily Flow. Please welcome your host, John Coleman.
We seem to be in love with story points, and I'll tell you a couple of stories. It was a team I worked with a few years ago, and they approached me one day and they said, John, we have this 8-point product backlog item that we're using Scrum, and we did a lot of work this sprint, and we really feel like we should get credit for the work that we've done. And we're thinking of splitting the story. I have 5 points for the development that was done, if you like, and they were doing software, and the remaining 3 points for testing, we'll leave that for the next sprint kind of thing. And I said to them, no, that's not done. You can't count story points. You shouldn't count story points unless the item is actually done. There's a model called the logic model from the WK College Foundation. Starts with inputs, budget, people, things like that, customer needs, and so on. And then you got activities, which is, well, if it's software, maybe you're doing software development, you're doing some UX, you're doing some technical writing or whatever. If you're trying to get some work out the door, then you need to get all that work done together before it's actually done. And it's not really a very good practice for teams to be claiming credit for story points, basically, when the item isn't done. And I call it story point bingo. And it's one of the reasons why I really discourage people from using story points, because everywhere that I see story points being used, somebody measures it. Be careful what you ask for. When teams are measuring, I've got this item versus this item, what size of these, and so on. Before you know it, people are inflating every size because they know they're being measured on story points. So a cheap way to get to that would be when they do the initial estimate, they just size it as slightly bigger. And so you get story point inflation. And I'll tell you a little story from a lady I taught in Vienna, PSM2, a couple of years ago. And she said a director came to her one day, and the director said, we really need to improve our velocity here. It's not good enough. The other teams are doing much better. He didn't understand that the number of story points is a measure within the team. It's not something you do across multiple teams. And so he said, yeah, you need to have more velocity. He meant was you need more story points. Velocity can also mean the number of items you deliver. And so what she did was she went off to the team and she said, I'm not being deceitful here, but I want to do an experiment. And I have this feeling, I just want to give it a go. So my hypothesis is that if we add 5 points to every single item, that this guy will back off. And then we can maybe tell him what we've actually done, so he won't ask us about that again. The team added 5 points to every single item from there on in. And 3 months later, that director approached her and said, oh, that's much better now. You've really you've got much better velocity. That's fantastic. Well done. And then she told him what she did. And he never asked for velocity again. So all sorts of problems with it. There's an alternative, which is throughput. Throughput is counting the number of items that go through a time period. If it's Scrum, you'd have a sprint. And you can say, we normally deliver, say, 3 to 5 items in a sprint. Maybe we should have 3 to 5 items in this sprint. Why were you thinking of bringing in 8, kind of thing? Now, a lot of you out there might be thinking, well, we got items of different size and all that kind of thing. And the reality is that unless you really have what I call slice of cake teams, where you can deliver all the functionality integrated within the one sprint, unless you actually have that capability, you call that a slice of cake team. If you have a layer of cake team, as in like front end team, middleware team, back end team, and so on, or packaging team, communications team, different types of work, and so on. If you have dependencies between those layers, then those layers will cause waiting. So more than 90% of how long things take is actually waiting time. Best personified by a reaction I got from a chap I worked with in New Zealand a number of years ago. And he said, John, that's going to take 10 minutes. But things are so crap around here, I'm going to say 2 days. And that was actually a genius answer. He understood there was actually no correlation, little or no correlation between estimated effort and how long things take. Now, there can be value in people having conversations about, is this a big or small or whatever, just in terms of people psychologically feeling better about it, but actually in terms of it making a difference in terms of your forecasting, It's next to useless. Story points are, in my book, are next to useless. People, they use burn-up charts, burn-down charts, and even if they're not doing story point bingo and story point inflation, which they probably are, they're probably measuring averages. If you plan an average, you could succeed an average, but you could also fail an average. 50-50 doesn't seem to be a very good way to manage your career, if you ask me. So if you do throughput, if you count the number of items, people say, how could that be gamed? Because if you give humans any system, they'll game it, they'll find a way, won't they? So how could you game throughput? Well, you could reduce the size of your items. And actually, I think that's okay, to a limit. Each item needs to be valuable. So if you're breaking down your product backlog items to an extent that really they're just tasks now, and actually there's no real value in and of themselves, then you lost the plot, actually. So counting product backlog items that deliver value, or in Kanban we call them work items. A work item is something that delivers value. And if the item is small that delivers the value, that means the team is probably simplifying. They might be doing 80-20. How can we get 80% of the outcomes or 20% of the outputs? And the downsides of throughput are not as bad as the downsides of story points. So let's put it that way. Now, another thing that I've seen people talking about is, oh, I know, I don't really understand this Monte Carlo thing. So I know what we'll do. We'll average our throughput. So we've got 30 items left on the backlog, and we do 3 to 5 items in a sprint. So we do straight math. And I would say to you, that's prone to the same 50-50 error that I just talked about a while ago. And the other thing as well, there's a thing called Little's Law, the relationship between the amount of work that we have going on at the same time, how long things take, and how many things we deliver per time period. And the more items you add in, the more likely it is that your cycle times will go up. There's certain cases where, when the system isn't fully loaded, you keep adding more work in and you can still deliver more stuff. But then there comes a point where you hit a kind of a tipping point, if you like, and then beyond that point, everything's taking longer. And if everything's taking longer, the cycle time is taking longer, then your throughput can go down. Well, we can look at that throughput and we can, Little's Law it's called. Little's Law is used to describe what happened in the past. It's not used for describing what's coming in the future. So one of the reasons why I prefer to use Monte Carlo probabilistic forecasting is because you're not gambling that past performance is going to be an indicator of future performance. Monte Carlo does take past performance into account, because essentially what it does is says, okay, it looks at our limits. Okay, so how many items do we deliver per day, per week, per sprint, whatever our time period is, and how big is the backlog right now, and how small might it get, how big might it get. And if you don't have any sprints in the past where you deliver 10 items, the Monte Carlo simulation will not have 10 in there. It won't be in there. Lower number is a limit. So it'll fire random numbers at your throughput based on the number of items in your backlog. And it'll come up with all these simulations, and it creates a bit of a histogram. And you'd be a fool to pick the middle of the histogram, because that's 50-50 heads or tails. And so what most people do is they move to the right-hand side of the histogram, usually 85th percentile. Why? Because it's between 70 and 100. It could be 95th if you want to. It depends on your appetite for risk. And that tends to be a later date, because there's been bad scenarios where the backlog was bigger and the throughput was lower, and it takes that into account. And I prefer to use that than to use average throughput. Even for the current sprint, actually, I prefer. That's my personal preference. I don't have a problem with people using throughput for the current sprint, because it's only one sprint. It's a short time period. How much harm can it be if you're delivering 3 to 5 items the last few sprints? Maybe 3 to 5 items is probably okay for the sprint as well. But if you're looking forward multiple sprints and you're trying to set expectations about when things might be done, I prefer to use Monte Carlo probabilistic forecasting. When you have a forecast, you will come up with a date and maybe a percentage likelihood that you'll deliver by that date. So if it was 85th percentile, you might say 85% chance we'll deliver by the 15th of April. That means there's 15% chance we won't deliver by the 15th of April. And one of my colleagues adds a wonderful phrase, which I keep quoting him on. So what he says is, and I'll give you a better forecast next week. Just in saying, and I'll give you a better forecast next week, he's basically saying that the current forecast is probably wrong. And so getting the stakeholders used to that uncertainty in relation to the forecast. I prefer to use this even in complexity. It's a bit smoke and mirrors still, but I prefer to use this in complexity, continually couching the answer with uncertainty, than saying, I don't know. And that's my personal preference for action, because when you say, I don't know, which is actually the right answer, Monte Carlo is just a very polite way of saying we don't know. Here's all the lovely graphs. Here's the percentages. We could still miss it. And by the way, we'll give you a better forecast next week. We could still be wrong. But I prefer to give people something than nothing, because in a vacuum, somebody will fill it. And guess what they'll fill it with? Probably story points. Okay, so keep an eye on that. That's why Bas Vada said in his 3-day certified less practitioner with me, he said, I prefer to use historical time reference than story points, because the impact of referring to items we did in the past is less than the impact of story point inflation, story point bingo, and all those other kind of bad things that happen in human behavior when people use story points to measure how many things they deliver. The other thing to remember as well, by the way, is that whether you use story points or throughput or whatever you're using, you're still not measuring outcomes. So they look into another framework that we might look into another day: evidence-based management, value management. How do we manage how much value we're delivering? Ultimately, we need to be getting something into the hands of the customer, the end user, getting some feedback, seeing some changes in customer behavior. And that's really what it's all about, is about delivering value. So sometimes we even get lost even with throughput. So just remember, it's just a proxy for figuring out if there's some chance of delivering some value. But story points, I would say avoid. I have had situations where I did use them, but I'd use them through the back door. So what I did was, let's say there was a whole backlog, and I'm dealing with the psychological noise. Oh, there's some elephants in the backlog and they're just not accepting. And so I said, okay, let's break down the product goal into outcomes effects, and break those outcomes effects into higher level product backlog items. And then let's break them down into the more detailed items, if you like. Not fully refined, you never have the backlog fully refined, but having some idea of the backlog on a wall. And I might say to the team, if they're really struggling with this message of truth, because there's some people like it's counterintuitive, so they don't accept it. They want to do story points because it's just like the default path for a lot of people. Some people, they don't even know about story points, and if they don't know about it, I would advise you not to educate them on it, because it's a bad path. But what I do is I would say, okay, gals, guys, have a look at the wall there. What's the smallest item on the wall? Oh, that one over there. They find one over there. Okay. Is there any other one like that? Yeah, that one over here. Any other? Yeah, that. Okay. Any more? No. I skip every second size. So I don't have small and medium. I then go to medium. So, okay. So what's the next one? We're looking at mediums now. Oh, this one over here. Okay. Any other ones like that? Yeah, you get the idea. Boom, 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 boom. 20 minutes later, I've got small, medium, large, double extra large, quadruple extra large, question mark. A lot of people make a mistake in limiting to the top size. Big mistake. Because you're hiding complexity there when you do that. And anyway, they do the t-shirt sizes. So the whole thing, 20 minutes, any backlog, is t-shirt sized. And then what I do is I say, okay, that t-shirt size, there's a scale there that matches to that. So that's worth that many points, that's worth that many points. And so they have some idea of the relative effort. And you can even punch that into Monte Carlo. I don't recommend it, but you can. Troy McGinnis has some free tools where you can check it out on my YouTube channel, where you can basically put in the backlog might be this number of points to that number of points, very optimistic, very pessimistic. How many points do we deliver in a sprint? Very optimistic, very pessimistic. What's the median, and so on. You can use that, and I have used it for teams where they were not ready for throughput yet. And yeah, but that's all I use it for, just to get a rough order size of the backlog at the start. I try to get them into throughput as quickly as possible, just counting the number of items. And if they are using burn up, burn down charts, I show them the burn up, burn down charts, and then I show them next to it the throughput charts in the Monte Carlo, and they can see that the flow metrics are actually giving a more accurate, there's still low accuracy, but a more accurate prediction of what's going on. So be very, very careful with story points, with historical time reference in the past. The genius of that is when you're looking back, it includes waiting time. If you think about it, you don't say, oh, I estimated that was going to take 5 days. You remember that it took 2. So that's kind of nice. There's a problem with historical time reference in that there's a concept from J.P. Rainsberger on accidental complication, where that item, you think it's like that item that you did last year, but it's actually not, because when you lift the hood, when you lift the bonnet, you can see all sorts of mess underneath which you didn't account for. And so it's actually much worse than that. Even that's not great. I go for throughput, and to avoid the idea of elephants coming into sprints and something on for using Scrum, I'd recommend the use of right sizing, which would be trying to break the items down just so they fit into a sprint. We don't worry whether they're small or medium. Can they fit into a sprint or not? If they can, that's okay. And otherwise, they need to be broken down at some point. And the level of urgency depends on how high up the backlog they are in Scrum, or high up there the input queue, or how likely they to be selected next in a Kanban workflow. If you have any more questions, this is an episode as a response to some questions from previous episodes. If you have any more questions, just give me a shout. I'm very happy to address them. Thank you.